Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello and welcome back to the show. As we age, muscle loss becomes a serious concern, increasing the risk of sarcopenia. How can we maintain our muscle mass and our overall health? In today's episode, we'll dive into how we can maintain our muscle, especially amongst the aging population. Today, we have a very special guest whose research interest is in muscle health and regeneration and has published plenty of publications in relation to skeletal muscle. Joining us is Dr. Michael Ryan Hicks, an assistant professor of physiology and biophysics, whose work focuses on understanding how our muscles grow, heal, and maintain strength over time. He is also an associate director for UC Irvine for Muscle Biology and Disease Center. His expertise spans stem cell biology, regeneration, and skeletal muscle research, making him the perfect person to guide us through today's main topic, muscle health and aging, preventing sarcopenia. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Sabrina. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and can you share us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in researching the skeletal muscle?
Yes, absolutely. Again, thanks for having me. I've been studying skeletal muscle since I became a scientist in 2006. And I've always been fascinated by biology and what makes us living and how we function. In the same token, I was interested in sports. I grew up playing quite a bit of sports, and really the study of skeletal muscle physiology was the marriage of those two areas. I find skeletal muscle particularly fascinating because it's a voluntary organ. We have control over its movements, and it really is central to everything that we do for quality of life. Everything from being able to move to being able to have posture. It controls our diaphragm and ability to breathe and swallow and to be here with you today. So it's an area that, I quite find interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, it is quite fascinating and fascinating indeed because our other organs doesn't do that. We control our muscles, but we don't control our gut, we don't control our stomach, etc. And I see that one of your research interests is in regeneration. Is there any technology or medications available to regenerate muscle loss?
Thanks for that question. So let me describe the regenerative environment of skeletal muscle for you for a minute. Skeletal muscle is one of our most regenerative organs in our body. You could imagine a boxer taking a beating or a marathon runner pounding the pavement, burning through their legs. And skeletal muscle is resilient. Not only does it take that pounding, but it regenerates stronger than it was before. In the laboratory setting, we can apply toxins, for example, to study the muscle regeneration process. And you can almost completely ablate a muscle and it will repair itself. And this repair process is mediated by a resident stem cell pool population that each one of us has. And this resident stem cell pool population lives with you for your entire life. So even when you're 100 years old, you still have the ability to repair to some level. And these stem cells are called satellite cells. They were discovered in the 1960s. And they're called satellite cells because if you think of a satellite that orbits the Earth, these satellite cells orbit the muscle fibers. And so as the
Mm.
muscle becomes damaged in these different settings, the satellite cell can proliferate, make several copies of itself, and then fuse with the muscle to repair the damaged tissues. And so you asked about regeneration and different types of regenerative drugs.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, most regenerative drugs aren't over-the-counter medications that you or I could walk into the local pharmacy and receive.
Mhm.
Most regenerative drugs are at the prescription level, or they're at the experimental level. So, for example, there are drugs that regulate growth for people that maybe have an enzyme deficiency that have to regulate height. The one that is common is IGF-1, or insulin growth factor. That drug would be available, but only to a select population. And then there's a couple of drugs that are at the experimental stage that I find really quite fascinating. There's a group out of Stanford,
Mhm.
through the Helen Blau lab, that's studying a particular inhibitor of a enzyme that builds up in our muscle systems as we age. It's called prostaglandin dehydrogenase. And inhibiting this enzyme can really restore muscle mass and function for aging populations. And that's an experimental drug that is, at the clinical trial stage. I think that I look forward to seeing where it'll be in the future.
That's really fascinating. And who are the recipients of these drugs, as you mentioned, because this is not something that we can get over the counter?
Usually, recipients of drugs are patients that have genetic mutation, for example.
Mm.
For example, one of the diseases that I study in the lab is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And in this particular disease, the satellite cells, which we were talking about, that are responsible for the regeneration of the muscle, have a dysfunction, meaning they don't
I see.
behave the way that they should behave. And so those types of patients are more at the cutting edge, that these orphan disease patients that are more of a need than, say, you or I, who would be relatively healthy with relatively normal functioning muscle.
I see. So it's more to people who are in lacking that particular function in their body. And that is actually, that serves a great preface to our topic for the day. But before we go further into detail, let's break the ice and get to know you a bit better. So this is Have You Met Michael? Okay, so Michael, let's get to know you a little bit before we go and dive deep. So what do you do in your spare time?
Thanks for that question. As you would imagine, I do quite a bit of work, but I try to have some hobbies outside of work. A fun fact, I live in the California area, in Los Angeles city area. And as you know, Los Angeles is famous for acting.
Mm,
And so this year, 2025, one of my New Year's resolutions was to enroll in an acting class.
acting class.
Yes,
Wow.
yes. And I just coming from class, in fact.
Oh.
Today we were rehearsing scenes with circumstance. So trying to apply made believe previous circumstance to enhance our character's role. And I find it quite fascinating. I took the class in part to be a better public speaker, but I've
Oh.
discovered quite a bit about myself. And an analogy would be the astronauts that go to the moon and they look back at the Earth and they see the Earth in a new light. And a lot of times, I think that it's similar in that way, because you step into this role as an actor and then you look back on yourself in a new way. You kind of see yourself differently with a different set of truth, if you will. And so
Yeah, like
that's one thing that I do for fun on the side.
yeah, that's really interesting as your 2025 resolution. I would never imagine one of the scientists that works in a lab tries to go acting and takes an acting class.
I had
Okay.
to do these thing called an elevator pitch. It's
Yeah.
a 2-minute pitch on why I find my research to be impactful and why people should care about it. And to do this elevator pitch, I had to stand in front of a camera and there was a green screen behind me. And I realized that I'm awful in front of the camera. And so I enrolled for that purpose because, I don't like to be unprepared for things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an idea to maybe get better.
I see. So I hope you get better at talking in front of camera like you are doing right now. And do you read any books? And if you do, what's a favorite of yours?
Well, I was thinking about this question of books that I read, and I do read some books.
Mm-hmm.
I read quite often, because I read every single day, the science literature, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for starters, especially if we're writing like a research proposal, I may read 20 or 30 science journals in a week, trying to understand the body of research. And I really hope to convey that in our session today, that there's a lot of really great scientists out there that have built into the plethora of knowledge base for the aging field. And so some of the journals that I read are things like Cell Stem Cell and Nature Biotechnology, and I find them quite fascinating. On the other side, I also read 2 or 3 times a week, but I have to confess, I have a 1-year-old daughter.
Ah.
And so I am almost constantly reading books to her. And I really enjoy picture books that I can improv the story to
Oh.
and really work on the vocabulary with her. So a 1-year-old, they're really expanding their vocabulary every single day. It's really a remarkable sight to see, and to be able to go through books like The Little Engine That Could, or others, I find really, really fun to do.
Yeah, they are at the golden age where they absorb knowledge like a sponge. And what about films or TV shows that you are currently watching? Any films?
I just watched the Academy Awards last weekend, and so I was able to watch a movie that was kind of inappropriate in many ways, but it won the Best Picture of the Academy Awards this year, called Anora. And this is a movie about a New York girl from the inner city who is pretty tough, and she ends up marrying this Russian playboy type on a whim. And the family of that Russian playboy are these oligarchs, and they are not happy that they got married together. And so they try to force an annulment. And I won't give away too much of that movie, but it's pretty intense. So I saw that one pretty recently.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good teaser to our listeners back home. And is there any podcast that you listen to nowadays?
There are 2 that I particularly like. The first is The Moth, Stories Worth Telling. It is a podcast based on everyday people with interesting stories, usually around 15 minutes, that are quite engaging and coming of age type stories. And they usually have some sort of life lesson involved in the story. And I find them quite entertaining. The Moth. They also have a Moth restaurant, if you will, in Los Angeles, where you can go to watch live performances. And so I've been there a few times.
Wow.
A second one, which is a little bit more, I would say, nerdy, is Stem Cell Technologies hosts a podcast, and it is on scientists that publish research articles, and it's hosted by a couple of Ph.D s, and they break down the research articles of of that month or within that time frame. And it's pretty educational, I think, that one as well.
That one's very interesting. I've never heard of nerdy. And last question for this segment is, if do you have any role model, or who do you look up to the most?
You know, I try to see the light in many people. And so I look up to several people, and the list is quite long. I would say that I would like to give a acknowledgement to the people that have really mentored me through science. And when I was an undergrad, I first picked up a pipette and studied in a skeletal muscle lab at Arizona State University with Jean Wilson Rawls. And she really got me engaged in this field, and I really look up to her. And during my Ph.D., I studied under Dr. Paul Stanley, and he's the dean of curricular affairs for the University of Arizona School of Medicine. And he really taught me to think like a scientist and ask hypothesis-driven research and to seek alternative conclusions instead of the, what are all the possibilities there? And during my postdoc, I worked with Dr. April Pyle at UCLA. And one thing that I would say for her particular was, at that point, I thought I would have a good idea. Like, oh, I got this great idea. What do you think? And she would always expand on it and take my good idea and just take it way to the next level of, explore your possibilities. And so I'd really say that the mentors in my personal training are absolute role models and people that I enjoy speaking to this day. And last, I would say, particularly in the field of aging, there's a number of really fantastic skeletal muscle biologists that should be acknowledged for their work in the aging field. And this includes doctors Pura Munoz-Canoves, currently at Altos. She's someone that I really look up to in her research. Dr. Helen Blau, Dr. Tom Rando, and Dr. Andrew Brack, among many others. But those four people, if they come out with a science article on aging, I automatically am gravitated toward it to learn more.
Well, you seem to have a lot of role model in terms of your work, and that follows through our very first question to the topic of the day. How would you define longevity, Michael?
I define longevity in a broad term. In the broadest sense, longevity is the length of a person or a thing in terms of their lasting potential. You think of a car engine, the longevity might be the time that it lasts before it starts to give out, or your tires. In human, that longevity is really broken down, I would say, into two parts. One is your lifespan. How long do you live? And for an average person, say that's 80 years, or if you're lucky, 90 or 100 years old. The other component of that is your health span. And health span is how long did you live with a quality of life, not just a lasting life, but we're able to live independently and be fulfilled and to carry out the daily activities of life. And so longevity really maybe encompasses both aspects in context for humans, is health and lifespan.
I see. So both encompasses how long we can live until we die and how long we can stay healthy during that lifetime. And how would you define the relationship between our muscle health and longevity itself?
The skeletal muscle, as I said previous, is really central to everything that we are able to do because it's our voluntary muscular system. Skeletal muscle is not only important for the daily activities of living independently in our age, but it's also an important component for other factors. For example, for our cardiovascular health, right? If you have healthy muscle, you're living healthier, you're allowing for the movement of fluids and the contraction of your heart and more. There are a number of studies that show that exercise can prevent cognitive decline. And so skeletal muscle can serve several roles in terms of cognition and cardiovascular health, blood flow, as well as overall living a more fulfilling life. One of the studies have shown that being social and having social interactions with folks as we age is really critical to their life fulfillment and lifespan. And having skeletal muscle that is healthy and able to carry out those roles is really key to doing that.
I see. And in talking about skeletal muscle, could you explain what sarcopenia represents in the context of overall health, particularly as we age?
So sarcopenia is defined as age-related muscle loss. And we typically start to lose a percentage of our muscle mass after the age of 30 and onwards. And it maybe accelerates in your 60s and in your 70s. Now, what I can speak to firsthand is being able to see skeletal muscle biopsies from aged people in the laboratory. And so what does age-related muscle loss look like at the tissue level when you're talking about sarcopenia? And there's a couple of things that I would say that are sarcopenia related. In fact, it spans everything, because it really starts at the DNA level, right? The DNA level is really where you start to see sarcopenia occur. In fact, there's a new discovery called the biological clock. And your DNA on it can have these different methylation groups. Think about them as just different chemicals that attach onto the DNA. And a recent discovery was able to match those chemical compounds that bind to the sides of DNA to the biological age of the person. And I want to think about biological age as different than chronological age. So chronological age is the year you were born. Okay, you were born in 1980 or 1990, but your biological age can be a different time. So it really starts at the DNA level, sarcopenia. And then DNA can get transcribed into genes, and those genes are called RNA. And RNA also becomes dysfunctional as we age. And so one of the diseases that my lab has been studying in collaboration with Armando Vialta here at UC Irvine is an age-related disease called inclusion body myositis. And in this case, you have the immune system that attacks the aged muscle. So as we age, our immune system becomes more activated, but particularly in this age-related disease called IBM, the immune system attacks it. And the reason for that is, in theory, coming from the RNA not undergoing its processing correctly. And so you could think of the RNA as a traffic jam. So think about a city with mopeds and cars and everything going into an
All at
intersection with
once.
no light, right? That is the RNA in a aged muscle not getting to be translated correctly. And this buildup becomes like a tangle of lights. And so work from Dr. Bradley Olwen's lab at University of Colorado has really been studying these RNA granules that are forming in inclusion body myositis as we age. So you have these molecular components that start to go wrong as we age. And then on the tissue level, what that looks like is the muscle fibers. And if you think of a muscle fiber, think of maybe your bicep muscle as an easy one to consider. A bicep runs from your elbow to your shoulder. There's a single fiber that is that length. It's very skinny, but it is several centimeters in length, right? Very long. Those undergo atrophy as we age. And so the cross-sectional area of those fibers go from this size to this size, and they shrink in size. And as they shrink in size, so muscle is compacted like this. But as they shrink in size, they go away from each other. And that space in the middle starts to be filled in with extracellular stuff. You could think of it as like almost like an internal scar, if you will. And that external stuff takes up more tissue over time. And it almost does it, think of it in like polka dot forms. So it doesn't do it uniformly in all spaces of the muscle all at once. It does it in these polka dots where there's lesions that occur all over the muscle. And in sarcopenia, when we see this on tissues, you could actually give me two tissues from a young person and an old person, and you could immediately determine, based on that accumulation of extracellular tissue, which one is the aged tissue. So you have all of these different components going on. You have an increase in inflammation as well. And overall, that is going to relate to a reduction in muscle mass and a reduction in muscle strength, which we term as sarcopenia.
I see. So sarcopenia is a muscle atrophy related disease as we age?
I would
in short?
absolutely, yes, in short.
And how does sarcopenia impact mobility and independence in older adults?
Good question. So, as you would imagine, when we start to lose our muscle mass, you start to lose you also start to lose your mobility as we age. With that said, not all muscles lose muscle mass at the same rate or are susceptible to muscle atrophy at the same rate. I would like to go back to this idea of one of the role models that you mentioned. My personal role model is my grandpa. He lived until he was 97 years old. And up into his 90s, he would shake my hand, and he had such strong grip strength. Even when he was in his 90s, it would break my knuckles quite. and everyone that knew him and his social group would joke about being terrified to give him a handshake because of the strength of his hands, right? And at the same time, other parts of his body did not maintain their strength as much, right? You think of leg muscles and your quadricep muscles that allow for things like balance. And so your muscles do not age all equally at the same time. Face muscles, they stay pretty strong relative to other muscles in your body. One of the
Indeed.
muscles that my lab studies quite in depth, which is funded by the National Institute of Aging, are the rotator cuff muscles.
Sure.
These are the muscles that control your shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
There's four of them. They're posterior, so in your back, posterior to your deltoid. Yeah. And they're particularly susceptible to aging. So as we go through our lives and we're moving our arms and moving and lifting our shoulders, the rotator cuff muscles atrophy and have increased propensity, or they're extra susceptible to being tears. In fact, 30% of people over the age of 65 experience a rotator cuff tear. And so it's quite a prevalent characteristic of sarcopenia. So so rotator cuff tears are an age-related disease, if you will. And the impact of that is a lack of mobility of your arms. So you could think of things like driving a stick shift and not being able to operate a vehicle correctly, or lifting dishes onto a shelf over your head. And so being able to use your shoulder muscle becomes really an impairment. And I can go into that biology in more detail as well. But just on the sarcopenia side, that's one that you have to look out for sure.
I see. So rotator cuffs, if it has atrophy, then it may be, or it's highly likely that it is an age-related sarcopenia. And as we are talking about sarcopenia, what medicine or drugs that can be used clinically to prevent sarcopenia as we age?
Apart from elite athletes, right, the strongest bodybuilders or the most endurance runners, most people have not peaked at their maximum muscle mass potential. And
Ah,
what I mean by that is, even though a person is approaching 70 and 80 years old, they still have potential to gain muscle mass,
oh,
right? Because they never peaked at their highest level. So even though they're decreasing in muscle mass, they can gain it. And of course, the number one way of doing that is through your exercise. And I would say, particularly thinking about diet and exercise, and hydration, particularly on that, is an important component for healthy aging.
I see. So far, there is no particular over-the-counter drugs for preventing sarcopenia.
There's not. Now,
I see.
I could tell you about a drug that we recently found, if you're interested, that I find interesting, but it's not. It might be over the counter, but it's not prescribed for aging.
I
Not yet,
see.
anyway.
I think we can go back to that in a little bit. And I'd like to ask a question in regards to how prevalent is sarcopenia among the aging population, and at what age does it typically begin to manifest?
In my opinion, sarcopenia, well, in my lab's research, I should say, we stratify aged versus young in the biopsy tissues that we get from the orthopedic surgeons at 60. And one could make a argument that 65 or 70 would be a more appropriate cutoff for where you would draw the line if you were just to binary say young and old.
Mm,
We drew the line at 60 in some ways because we were getting tissues at both categories in about equal buckets.
hmm.
But I would definitely say at the cellular level, if you stratify tissues from a clinic on 60 being that cutoff, you can see significant changes in the muscle between those two age groups.
I see. So, bottom line, it usually starts around 60 years old in terms of sarcopenia.
Yes. With that being said, as you could also know, elite athletes, usually retire in their early 40s as opposed
Mm,
to, say, in their 20s. Uh, so even at age 40, you begin to lose muscle mass relative to a 20-year-old.
I
Just not
see.
necessarily to the level of what I would call a sarcopenic muscle, but it does start to decrease early.
I see. So does this also relate to the biological health clock versus the chronological health clock?
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, so that is this concept that your DNA has these chemical groups that bind to it and that can actually be measured. via these machines. These methyl groups can be measured, and that isn't quite a linear curve, but you could pretty much think of it as linear with quite some bit of heterogeneity on there. And that's because there's a lot of factors in human health that influence the rate at which we age. And scientists in a laboratory a lot of times use model organisms to study the aging process. And those model organisms are essentially twins of themselves.
I
They're
see.
very much replicated in a lot of ways. But we as humans have so many multi-factors, including our lifestyle and our genetics, as well as a makeup of the genetics of who we are, that result in quite a wide breadth of variability in the process of how we age.
I see. And I'd like to go back to the question about your research lab. And what research does your lab do in terms of, you mentioned just now, you have found something in relation to sarcopenia, a drug.
Great. Yeah. So I'm funded by the National Institute of Health through the National Institute of Aging to understand the biological process of rotator cuff repairs. So when a surgeon reattaches the tendon, because a lot of times the muscle will tear at the muscle tendon interface. And so a surgeon many times will reattach the tendon at the bone, but the muscle will fail to repair. And we don't quite understand which patients will be responders to
I see.
surgery and which patients will not be. And so we set out to test the hypothesis that the muscle stem cells were dysfunctioning in some way, or that they were just lost. Maybe they just become exhausted and we just run out of them in these chronically damaged environments. Or with age, for example, maybe you just don't have them anymore. And so we collected over 40 patient samples from young and aged patients, from females, from males, from different levels of fatty infiltration and tear size. And we began to stratify all this data. And surprisingly, we found that the number of muscle stem cells, when you normalize it to the number of muscle fibers, was essentially the same in uninjured muscle as well as these rotator cuff muscle. We didn't see a difference. And that really threw a wrench in our hypothesis that you're losing muscle stem cells and therefore you can't repair. But then when we looked at the biology of those muscle stem cells, they started to express hallmarks of advanced age. Meaning, so there are proteins that aged skeletal muscle and aged muscle stem cells express. So markers like the P16 pathway and
I see.
This other one called beta gal. And so when we stained for those markers on the muscle stem cells, and they were normalized against aged controls that had no injury, these age accelerated markers were found on the muscle stem cells. And that was really mind-boggling to us. So the cells were there. They were just no longer functioning like healthy cells. They were functioning in this term called senescence. And senescence essentially means that the cell is alive, but it no longer functions or responds to the cues in the ways that it should. So what my lab specializes is taking tissues from a clinic, in this case, orthopedic clinic, digesting up that tissue and extracting very finely out the muscle stem cells using this specialized machine called a flow cytometer, which can get almost 100% pure muscle stem cells out of that.
Mm.
And we started to test every known drug that had been published in the scientific literature. And most of them had no effect on aged tissue. So we were using samples above the age of 75. But we found one that really worked gangbusters inside of a cell culture dish, at least. And this drug's called N-acetylcysteine. And N-acetylcysteine is an antioxidant. Our body produces this naturally, and it is available in different forms that you can purchase. N-acetylcysteine regulates a particular metabolite called glutathione. Now, I should also mention that we scoured the science literature looking for drugs, and the literature that we found from a well-known scientist was from Tom Rando's lab. So he and others had discovered this drug, but they had looked at it in mice. And so we were able to apply this in the human context. And so an interesting thing that we did is to show that the muscle stem cells from an aged person are actually more functional, not just proliferating more,
Oh.
making more of themselves. We treated aged muscle stem cells with this drug, N-acetylcysteine, and we transplanted them into a mouse that had a muscle injury to study whether the human cells could repair that injury. And so these mice, they're specialized mice you can have that don't have the immune cells, the adaptive immune system, and so they don't reject the xenotransplant of a human cell. And we saw a twofold increase when matched against number of cells when you treated these muscle stem cells with this drug N-acetylcysteine. Now, N-acetylcysteine is in America, we have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. This is an FDA-approved drug already. And so, but it's not used in the context of aging. It's used in the context of folks that have had too much Tylenol, acetaminophen poisoning, and you have
That's really interesting.
when you have an overdose on specific painkiller pills, they give you N-acetylcysteine because it's an antioxidant, and so it helps to regulate other tissue, like reduce the toxicity from drugs that people have overdosed on. So we hope to then repurpose this particular drug in contexts like aging or like rotator cuff tears that are unable to repair, to see whether we can stimulate the muscle stem cells to heal themselves better. So it's one to look out for, I would say.
Wow, yeah, that is really an interesting drug because it's something that's already out there in this world, and it's just repurposed then into something that's regenerative. That is it similar to antioxidants that reverses the aging step of muscles in that case, or does it just double the amount of it quickens the amount of reparation in the muscles?
Yeah, so this is a very potent antioxidant, N-acetylcysteine. I would definitely say, caution. I'm a Ph.D., right? I'm not a clinician that's treating patients, and so, speak to your own MD related doctor before trying any particular drug. I found it though in a cell culture dish that this drug really works well. It's something I'm really excited about, and it is a drug that is available. It does work through two things. It's an antioxidant, but it also regulates a particular metabolite. So it's a metabolite called glutathione, and it
Mm-mm.
is a precursor to that metabolite that allows for muscle to function more appropriately.
I see. That really is interesting. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about is about the practical applications of what we can do at home, since what you do is in the lab, right? So for our listeners back home, we know that resistance training is considered as the most effective strategy for counteracting sarcopenia. And why is that so? Why is resistance training effective?
Great question. So I would also mention, in addition to being a scientist, I'm pretty avid enthusiast for fitness. I've been going to the gym for more than 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm not saying that I'm super strong or anything because, again, I have a 1-year-old and I only have so much bandwidth, but I've been trained at the gym for many years. And so I can speak to this quite readily. One thing to keep in mind for viewers at home is what you can do in a practical sense is, as I mentioned, your skeletal muscles are highly regenerative, but your joints are not.
Ah.
Your joints are not regenerative. And so the key joints that I'm referring to are your knees, your hips, your lower back, and your shoulders. These areas, if they become damaged, are much slower to heal than the skeletal muscle is. And so as we age, we should take special care and work out those areas to strengthen those areas more readily. So for example, for your rear deltoid and your rear shoulders, rows can be a really effective treatment for your shoulder muscles. Or lat pulls. So you don't think about lat pulls when you're pulling on a bar. That would strengthen your lower back. So if you have stronger upper back, you're actually strengthening your lumbar spine more, right? I think that one of the biggest inhibitors of people going and lifting weights is that potentially they'll say, oh, my knee is bad, or oh, my lower back is hurt. And so you have to consider exercises that target and strengthen the joints as really a key to the aging. I don't recommend folks that don't go to the gym often to go hit their 3-rep max the first time they go to the gym. No, lift light, remember, as I mentioned, your fibrosis that kicks in with aging comes in these polka dots, right? They find your knot. Where's it hurt? And lift light in that space and work that out, and do 50% of your max until you can really feel warmed up, loosened up, and then maybe lift heavier, but start light.
Yeah, don't ego lift, start slow.
Yeah.
And yeah, you were about to say?
Yeah, back to your question about heavy lifting though, versus anaerobic exercise. When we age, we have two main groups of muscle fibers, and there's a lot of flavors of those, but two main ones to consider. And these are your endurance muscles, and they are called your slow twitch muscle fibers, and your strength muscles, and those are called your fast twitch.
Oh,
right?
That's interesting.
Yeah. So you have endurance and strength muscles. You could think of endurance muscles like your calf muscles, the ones that you use for walking. You go on a walk for quite some distance and you don't seem to get too tired. If you were to say, walk on your hands, if you had the balance to do so, your deltoid muscles would give out pretty quick. They're strength muscles, right? They're mostly strength muscles. And that's why when you work them out, they get really big and poppy. But they have fatigability quickly. As we age, our strength muscles are the first ones to go. And your endurance muscles stick around for a longer period. They're more resistant. That's not just true for aging, but it's also true for muscle disorders as well. And so strength training really targets the strength muscles and trying to prevent their particular susceptibility to sarcopenia.
I see. And as we are talking about anaerobic exercises and heavy lifting for those who are of age? And what is the recommended frequency, intensity, and duration of resistance exercises for older adults to combat muscle loss?
That's a great question, but I would try to frame that in the light that what's good for you. It's kind of like a batting stance, if you will.
Betting?
Batting stance, yeah.
Yeah.
You're a baseball player. It's really is what's comfortable for you, right? For some people, they might go to the gym 5 days a week, right? Other people, if you go a couple of days a week and then supplement that with other exercises, maybe that's sufficient. I I would really break muscle health into at least 4 buckets, right?
Oh,
So we talked about strength as one, and we talked about endurance as another, but there are a couple of additional ones. That includes flexibility, right? I've
mm-hmm.
seen bodybuilders that, can't touch their arms behind their back. They don't have, I think flexibility is really
Flexibility.
key. Yeah. And another one is coordination. Hand-eye coordination is really critical for overall muscle health. I saw some
Oh,
studies recently that people that live the longest are people that are not necessarily at the gym, but they're out playing tennis and,
oh,
and badminton. And that has some endurance to it for sure. And also there's some strength in swinging a tennis racket, but there's quite a bit of coordination to that. And so in my practice of fitness, those 4 areas should all be worked out in different areas. And particularly with aging, I would say flexibility with things like yoga are really critical. And then on the tissue level, an important thing to also keep in mind is hydration of your muscles and blood flow. Those will really make or break your muscle over the long period of time. And so things like massage therapy is probably one of the best things you can do for blood flow. It gets rid of buildup of fluid, things like edema, where you have this buildup of interstitial fluid stuck in random places that
oh,
feel
like the
that
knots that in your
yeah,
body?
knots,
Ah,
knots, yeah. And so in those knots, there's inflammation that's built up in those spaces, right? And that inflammation is damaging that tissue in that local area. And so things like massage therapy is really critical as well. So at the cellular level, hydration, drinking lots and lots of water. Aged people do not drink enough water, and getting the fluid flow and blood flow correct. But then also looking at those 4 different categories for your muscle health are all important. Particularly, a lot of people don't like to go to the gym, I would say, right? If you're aged,
indeed,
maybe,
indeed.
right? But there's other forms of exercise. As I mentioned, tennis is one of them. Forming a workout group that maybe goes down to the beach and does exercise at the beach as a group. Those type of things are not only important for our physical health, but maybe for our social well-being that also regulates longevity.
I see. So we did talk about our the type of exercises and what's good for our cellular health as well. But what role does protein intake? Because people who go to the gym really emphasizes on protein intake. And what role does it play in preventing and treating sarcopenia?
A couple of years ago, I had a friend visiting from Europe.
Hmm.
We're here in the United States. I was living in Arizona at the time, and she was making fun of me. She was making fun of America for our products at the grocery store. And
Yeah.
every product at the grocery store and she brought this to my attention: 17 grams of protein in your yogurt and 12
Yeah.
grams of protein in your cereal. And every single box of produce had some sort of now with added protein. And so, in my opinion, at least in the United States, I don't think that protein is the issue. I think that we have plenty of access to protein. I would say it's the ratio of protein to other food groups. And in particularly, it's the food that we shouldn't be eating that we are. And an example of that, there are some like breads that go stale in a day. And then there are other breads or muffins that seem to just never go stale for
Yeah.
like months on end.
Yeah, they just say.
Please avoid those. So if the muffin that you bought from Costco is still not stale after 3 months of sitting on your counter at room temperature,
Lord.
it's really telling that that is the food that you should be avoiding, right? So I think that in general, it's not so much the protein. And don't get me wrong, I love to have a protein shake after I work out. It's tasty and it's a good meal supplement, right? But it's mostly, I would say, it's mostly about what we are eating as opposed to like what we should be eating more of. It's more of getting rid of those bad things. And also, really supplementing those with greens
Mm.
because they're essentially water. You could think of eating greens as drinking water. That's mostly is. And that is almost a delayed water release to our tissues and muscle. That's really important.
I see. Delayed water
Yeah.
release to our
Yeah.
body. And let's go back a little bit to exercise because we did talk a lot about the diet and how effective it is. How effective are multi-component exercise programs? As you mentioned, there are 4 different areas that we need to include. They include balance and flexibility training in addition to strength exercises and, as you mentioned, the hand-eye coordination.
I would say it's the most effective thing that we have. Evolutionarily, our muscles have learned to adapt, and we have these well into our aged life. As I mentioned, the skeletal muscle um, can continue to regenerate as we age, very long into aging. And um, things like you're saying, diet or stress, these things could be added compounds, or in this case, what we study is chronic injury, like a tear in your tendon, can lead to aging at an accelerated rate. And so I would say that, those components are what seem to be driving the aging, particularly in the skeletal muscle. And I would say that in general, this is every individual is different here, but exercise is probably the single greatest uh, preventer of age-related muscle loss.
I see. And there's this research about whole body vibration therapy. It has been discussed among researchers as a potential intervention for sarcopenia. And how does it compare to traditional exercise methods for individuals with limited mobility?
Well, there's some scientific literature on this topic. I was just reviewing a paper on electrical stimulation for spinal cord injury. And you could think
Mm.
about Christopher Reeve, right? Fell off a horse, spinal cord injury.
Oh.
Those vibration therapies do have some efficacy, particularly for nerve regeneration, but it's not like a magic bullet. It's not a magic bullet. It may help to some level because it's improving blood flow, right? That vibration itself is causing fluid movement to occur, and with blood flow comes increased nutrients and increased oxygen to the tissue of interest. Um, It could also be reducing some of that fibrotic tissue that's building up nearby the muscle that we talked about, because that fibrotic tissue is not just stagnant. It actually cross-links with itself. And the more it cross-links, the stronger it becomes and harder it is to break. And so these vibration therapies may help to release that to some extent. And so you could imagine a vibration type therapy as a prophylactic before you go work out, to maybe be like a warm-up stage.
I see.
Again, because folks should be cautious about working out as we age, in that it could lead to injury if you're not careful, right? If you go
Indeed.
lift some heavy weight without properly warming up or properly knowing your own self, you could actually cause more harm than good if you end up tearing a tendon or something like that. So
Ouch.
I would say these vibration therapies could actually be somewhat of a precursor, a prophylactic to like a warm up for working out. And in a similar context, these massage therapies could also be in that space. So during my Ph.D., I was funded by the Osteopathic Association. So these are similar to MDs, but they're called DO. It's a doctor with a DO. And they practice more of a holistic medicine approach. And so around our body, around our muscle, is this connective tissue. You could think of it like a sock that fits around a foot. There's this connective tissue that's holistically attaches to our body. And so, for example, you can have a tight shoulder and it results in a migraine in your head, but it's actually something that's caused much further away on your body. And so the osteopathic group practices these techniques, for example, called myofascial release, where it releases particular tension in your fascia, right, that surrounds the skeletal muscle. And similar in ways to the vibration therapies that you discussed, these types of myofascial release or things like massage therapies that target these buildup of connective tissue and this buildup of edemic inflammation can really have an impactful effect. And I'm a big believer in those type of stretch therapies for everyone throughout your life, not even just aging, but particularly for aging people.
I see. And for our listeners at home, maybe they want to start their exercise routine. And for the people who are aging, they want to increase their muscle mass. What's a habit you'd recommend practicing for increasing muscle mass for beginners?
The simplest things that you can do is first make a friend. If you haven't, if you haven't had a friend already, make a friend. Because a lot of times these types of exercises can be social in nature. And not only that, but a lot of times a friend, especially one that's also, make a friend that's already going to the gym or already involved in some sort of social group or tennis club, because they'll hold you accountable on the days where you're, I'm too tired, it's it's too cloudy. They hold you accountable to go walk out the front door. So that's step one, I would say, for beginners, is make a friend. The second thing, and this is a little bit, I think, harder, is don't worry about what other people think, right? So we go to the gym and we might compare ourselves to others, right?
That's correct.
So you go onto for example, you go over to the free weights and somebody's bench pressing 185 pounds and you're thinking, I can't bench press that, or I can only bench press it once and I don't look cool, right? There's this factor. Oh, and so if you're elderly, you're in your 70s, you're like, I can't lift that at all. right? Oh, I'm not going there. That's for young people. And that's a mind state of almost like, like self-judgment, right? But there are places at the gym like the circuit training area, right? And so
Mhm.
people can't really see what you're lifting anyway. And don't feel bad if you're only lifting 20 pounds. So what? Just look at your own self and don't be so self-judgmental about what other people think of you and what you're doing. And I think that's actually the number one inhibitor of why old people don't go to the gym, is that it's some sort of weird self-awareness of thinking, oh, well, it's only for young people. It's only
Yeah.
for people that are too fit. I'm too overweight to go there and people will look at me funny. And you just need to get that out of your head. Maybe put on some headphones or something, and just ignore people or something on that level. Or again, go with a friend that you feel comfortable with. I would say those are the two main things. It's not so much about what you lift. I believe that 80% of life is just showing up. Just go, just go there. Copycat some other person at a lower weight, like, oh, what did they
Mhm.
do? And that's what I'd say is the best starting point.
I think that is a really good advice, especially to beginners, because a lot of the times they want something that's more, give me a good advice, but sometimes all we need is to have that nudge to just start.
Just
And
start.
yeah, that's great. And now we are going to go into this segment called the open mic segment, because we have finished talking about the practices that we can do at home. So in this segment, Michael, you have the chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to the topic. It can be related to the topic as well. So stage is yours.
What am I passionate about?
Anything.
I'm passionate about a lot of things.
Same.
Um, I would say, my main research focus
Mm-hmm.
and what my lab has been involved in primarily are stem cell therapies. And that's a really broad topic, um, with some negative connotations, in my opinion, even because there are direct to consumer stem cell markets that take advantage of people, but true cell therapies that are looking to cure diseases are
Mm-hmm.
just so amazing. The skeletal, that's what I really got into this space for, where my lab is really focused. During my PhD, I got to read about taking satellite cells from one donor mouse and then transplanting them into this recipient mouse, and it would create a whole new muscle. And I thought that was just one of the most fascinating things. They showed that a single muscle stem cell could form like 100 new muscle fibers inside of a recipient. And so my lab is really interested in pursuing cell therapies for individuals, and including aging. So in the future, we talked a lot about regenerative therapies applying particular drugs like N-acetylcysteine. But in the future, I really want to be able to use stem cells to replace the aged or senescent cells of our body with healthy new cells. And
Wow.
yeah, and I just find that area particularly fascinating. So my lab is really looking to create muscle cells in a dish that behave just like the muscle cells in our body for
Wow.
these types of cell therapies. And in 2007, a group in Japan led by Shinya Yamanaka discovered a way of taking anybody's cells, your cells, my cells, etc., taking a small biopsy, and they could reprogram them into this embryonic state called a pluripotent cell. They can
Mm.
make these pluripotent cells that could then go on to make any cell type in the body. And think about like a developing embryo can make any cell in the
Mm.
body. But they figured out a way of doing that with adult cells, adult skin cells or blood cells or any cell. You could reprogram it to become essentially like an embryo, but it's you. It's an exact copy of you. And
Wow.
they found the way to rearrange the DNA in a way to make those cells be, right? So my lab is really focused on taking pluripotent cells and creating skeletal muscle out of them in a dish. And those cells I could then, if it was a biopsy from me, I could transplant it back into myself, and it would be an exact young replica of myself, because that reprogramming resets the epigenetic clock to be the day zero of you, right? So you are now day zero Sabrina, and I am now day zero, but it's in a dish. So then how do you get that cell to then mature and become to some level a muscle? That is a challenge. And then how would you deliver it back to you, right? And so in the context of aging, you would be able to give yourself back young cell versions of yourself in the at least targeted areas, because we have 640 muscles in our body, and transplanting every muscle might be engineering challenge, if you will, technically challenging. But into particularly susceptible muscle, like the rotator cuff muscles, you could imagine culturing cells in a dish of yourself that are a younger version of yourself to then transplant back. So that's really my hope for the scientific field and also for people, is this idea for stem cell or autologous stem cell therapy in the future.
I'm quite mind blown, and I believe that the listeners back home also is as mind blown as I am. And the future of the regenerative cells future seems bright with you at hand. And thank you very much, Michael, for joining us today. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
2 places. My name is Michael Hicks. So if you go to hickslab.org, you'll find me. And really, if you just type in Michael Hicks, UC Irvine, my faculty page and more information about my email and things, you'd be able to find pretty quickly by Googling. And I'm always happy to answer questions and to receive feedback from anyone that's listening. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. And you can find out where Michael Hicks is down below, and we'll catch you in the next episode. See you.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.